Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you are at this moment. And I welcome you to this webinar, Developing Future Strategy, brought to you by the Balanced Scorecard Institute and in support of our strategic partnership with Informa for the upcoming Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, December Future Strategy Conference. This is Joe DiCarlo. I'm Vice President of Engagement Delivery and Senior Consultant at the Institute. And the conference in Riyadh is shown here in terms of its registration capabilities. The theme of the conference is empowering people and organizations to achieve strategic excellence. And it runs from December 2 to 6. There's a number of workshops. The conference is a couple of days. And I'm running a master class from December 4 to 6 as a part of this conference at all. And you will be getting a copy of this entire presentation today via a link that will be made available after the presentation. And you'll be able to download this entire set of slides, and that way you can have the contact information for the conference. I'm 45 years, just passing the 45-year mark in business on my third work-life career. Spent 13 years at the Milwaukee School of Engineering University, and the last 6 was Senior Vice President of Administration and instructor. I went on to the IBM Corporation in 1985 and retired from there in 2009 after 25 years. Held a number of positions there in management as well as systems engineering, and also had a specialization in artificial intelligence and expert systems. And those stations were in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and San Jose, California. Upon retirement, I went as an executive in residence at the Plug and Play Tech Center in Sunnyvale, California, and that is a startup organization for Silicon Valley startups. And at any one time, they have between 250, 260 startups under 3 roofs in Sunnyvale, Palo Alto, and Redwood City. I have a bachelor's in industrial management, an MBA in technology management, and I'm a doctoral candidate with the University of Phoenix. So when we talk about future strategy, there are a number of things that you have to take into account that are actually under an accelerated pace of development and delivery now that is having a direct effect on strategy development and strategy execution. And trying to sum up exactly what success means on future strategy, I put together this statement: success in the future relies on nonstop strategic thinking, planning, execution, accepting the need for accelerated change, innovation, communications, project management, diligence, and being wildly successful at moving performance outcomes higher. I've seen enough examples of strategy inside of IBM and also with the clients that I've been working on, is that this acceptance of that there's a need for accelerated change and continual momentum sometimes falters, even with the best design strategy, and even after a time when the strategy has been rolled out and is executing. I'm going to talk about core strategy development and execution components. There are a number of these. The cores are on this slide, and it doesn't matter from what aspect you look at strategy development, because these are all pretty standard components that have to be available in some way, shape, or form if you have a fully developed strategic plan. You're going to do assessments of any number. Typical assessments are to start off a process like this. Maybe you're doing an internal employee survey, you're doing focus groups. If you're a government agency or a nonprofit, you're doing interviews and surveys with key stakeholders, both inside and outside the organization. You're doing traditional assessments like a SWOT analysis or a competitive assessment if you're a for-profit organization. And in some cases, we've had clients run a strategic management assessment of their organization by segment to see how ready they are for strategy development and how the execution might be, the outcome would be. You're going to move into strategy. Strategy here are things like you're creating your customer stakeholder needs and what they are, your mission and your vision, and in many cases, you will also take a look at potentially a strategy profile, which is a derivative work or from the Blue Ocean strategy methodology. You're going to develop strategic objectives. You may call them strategic goals, but they are the continuous improvement activities that an organization has to do so that it can see if it's accomplishing its strategy overall. And it's that set that is rotated each year, same objectives, maybe some changes during the last step, or the last core, which is strategy evaluation. And they are the objectives or the goals to say, are we successful on our strategy? Every organization has to have a strategy visual, because this day and age, we're becoming more visually oriented, and we want to see a picture. We want to see how this all relates. And we don't want a report that's got 50, 60 pages of words and text when one picture will do adequacy and how our strategy interrelates between all levels of the organization. There are strategic measures and targets, or KPIs. These are the elements that are put in place against the strategic objectives so that we can determine through the measurement of the data that's associated with those KPIs if the objectives are being successful or not. And in the case of KPIs, it's not only selecting the KPI, but you have to have the right metric that's associated with them. And then, of course, you have to have the data that you need to bring into those KPIs in order to execute on. Strategic initiatives. These are strategic projects. Initiatives and projects are used interchangeably. These are standard projects measured and managed by project management methodologies, and they are the projects that are the second stream of influence against those objectives or goals. The first stream is being the KPIs, and the second stream of influence is the strategic projects. And they are specifically strategic projects. They are not operational projects. This particular case, I'll just give you a very simple example. We don't need to worry about a project at the strategic level if the project is repainting the parking lot. That's an operational project. Strategic projects, in this case, are very big and all-encompassing across the organization. Maybe the inclusion of an ERP system, maybe the startup of a customer relationship management system, which will have a number of impacts across the organization and other strategic objectives. Of course, you have to measure exactly and analyze what's going on with the strategy performance. So that performance analysis core is going to take a look at what's coming out of those strategic KPIs and targets, and also what's coming out of the strategic initiatives, and report back to management or to the board or the key stakeholders or to the employees exactly how the strategy is executing. And this is one of the most powerful systems of communication as well about strategy, because in this day and age, as you'll see in a minute, everything is all very visual driven, very connected driven, and can be displayed over a number of technologies to make it easy for individuals to see exactly how the strategy is executing. And it's also providing information for executives, because it is part of the data intelligence gathering business against the strategy, for the executives to take the information and make decisions based on what's coming out and what was designed for the KPIs and for the initiatives and the objectives. The strategy alignment portion is cascading or rolling down to the departments, divisions, individuals, and teams in terms of the overall organizational strategy. I make no bones about telling my students in class or clients that you can go ahead and create an organization-wide strategy, and it'll be a good one, but it only measures the organization as a whole. You cannot claim an aligned strategy until you've aligned it with the departments and divisions, and they create their strategy, and then you pass it down to the teams and individuals so that they know exactly what they need to do to support the strategy, going all the way back up the chain to the organization. And last but not least, core is strategy evaluation. You have to sit down several times during the year to look at the strategy as a whole, to see if it's giving you the information you need, if something needs to be fixed. Do the owners need to take a look at their objectives and say, we need to make a modification on collection, we need to make a modification on visuals, we need to make a modification in terms of what the KPI target should be. Those are all things that have to be looked at on at least a quarterly basis. And that evaluation we recommend from the Institute is that the fourth quarter is a deep dive. You get into it for a couple of days and you look at some of the key core elements that came out of assessments and strategy from the beginning of the year. Now, there are dimensions that affect the strategy development and execution. And this is a list that are part of those dimensions that do have some kind of an effect while you're building the strategy and while the strategy is executing. First is the leadership. The leadership has to stay engaged even after the strategy has been built and starts to execute. The leadership has to set the cadence and the momentum for how that strategy is going to be integrated into the organizations at all levels. Now, the one thing about leadership is when we say leadership in most organizations, people always think of those high-level executive suite positions. Leadership in strategy also encompasses managers, supervisors, and team leaders. Fundamentally, anyone that's looked up to as a leader and has a number of people reporting to them. So we take a very global look at leadership because they are as much responsible for execution of the strategy as well as the senior or executive suite. Culture, no question about it. Culture is a foundational dimension that needs to be assessed. You need to know where the gaps are in terms of a good culture implementation, and you need to think about some of the other elements that we'll see in a minute for each of these dimensions as we go forward. Strategic thinking stands to reason. I mean, you have to have an organization that is always thinking strategically. Where is that next good thing we can do? What efficiencies can we pick up? What do we have to do to help our customers in terms of what they're receiving and services? So they have to have a background and a thought process that this says, we're not satisfied with the way we are, we want to make things better. And that's the beginnings of strategic thinking. Process improvements go hand in hand with a strategy that's been put in place, and over the next 2 or 3 years, when the strategy is fully implemented and executing very well, sooner or later, senior management, senior staff, senior executives will say, how can we move our strategy even further? And this is at the point in time when you have to take a look at your processes. And because process improvements are the core of how every operation is handled in the organization. Of course, sustainability has to be built in because in a lot of organizations, in our case, predominantly military organizations, military commands rotate. I mean, they rotate 3 years, every 4 years. And what we say to firms, not only military but non-military, is you need to get your strategy in, you need to get it up and running, and you need to get it executing so that it runs. Once it runs and it's a part of the fabric of how the organization does business, it doesn't matter typically who's at the helm. You can get a change in a command general at some military base or some organization. The system runs as long as everyone is doing exactly as they've been assigned to do, and that builds in the sustainability. Communications is critical. We talked about strategic initiatives earlier. Communications and strategic initiatives, you're going to hear me say throughout this presentation, are 2 fault lines in strategy execution that can really crumble a strategy that's been built and has been done such that people don't continue to communicate about the strategy. And the second thing is on the projects or the initiatives, they don't execute on the projects. So those communications is critical. We'll talk more about that as we go through. Innovation goes without saying these days. In fact, I just was reading an article before this presentation about culture and innovation, and those two are becoming very, very integrated because a lot of firms know that in this day and age, you cannot ignore innovation on a number of horizons, and we'll talk about that when we get to the innovation dimension detail. Disruption, absolutely. Absolutely kind of mirrors with innovation, and if you're not doing innovation, the disruption will be a bigger hit. And the classic example that I use on disruption is the Mach 3 razor. Did the Mach 3 razor and Gillette ever think that something else would take its place? And well, guess what happened as soon as Harry's and Dollar Shave Club and Turbo Razor came on the scene? It disrupted the Gillette Mach 3, and it's probably captured a very good percentage of the market. So that was a disruptor. Even some things like Uber and Lyft and Flywheel and all of the rideshare things were a disruption to the normal transportation system. And so consequently, that leads to change. That innovation and disruption are going to drive change as much as developing the strategy created a change management aspect. So change management is something that never goes away, but probably changes, and in some cases that we've seen, changes in where its focus is going forward. And of course, in this day and age, risk is starting to really pick up in terms of what it does for the enterprise and what it does for projects, because there's two sides to the risk. It's the overall enterprise and it's the project side. And of course, there's going to be risks associated with your overall strategy. Workforce dynamics, very, very heavy effect of this dimension, because workforce dynamics gets to all levels of the workforce within the organization. And you're going to see quite a few exhibits on workforce dynamics, because at the end of the day, a team can build a very good strategy and start the execution, but if the workforce is not on board, the strategy does not leave the dock. It's as simple as that. So the workforce has to be totally engaged. The customer is still king. Everything you do, I don't care if you're a government agency, and the services that you provide for your customers or your constituents or your stakeholders, or if you're a for-profit organization, your customers are the ones that will set the tone as to where your strategy should be focused. Because after all, that's what you're building value for, is for the customer. And the customers could be on a number of planes, but it's what you deliver in products and services going forward. And of course, you cannot deny that you're going to have some financial oversight, because the finances of the organization are going to eventually evolve into three budgets: a strategy budget, a CapEx budget for capital projects, and an OpEx budget, so that you have operational budget for those annual projects. Now, what's driving future strategy and development and execution? And this is my view of the world, and I think I'm pretty well shared universally throughout the world. The only thing different in terms of my view of it is because I lived it starting about 1985 with the IBM Corporation. I was there before there were laptops, before there was internet, before there was email and smartphones. And I joined IBM at that green screen up in the upper right corner. You know, everything was tied to a mainframe. Well, the thing that is driving this change is Moore's Law, which basically says that the components are doubling just about every year that they can get on a chip. And this chart ends in 2015, and that's even continued, though it has started to knee off a little bit, but still doubling every year. The key thing here is just stop and think. If your laptop, your smartphone, or your tablet were gone tomorrow, I mean, what would you do? A lot of folks wouldn't even know what to do. Get back on the telephone, probably on a regular handset telephone to carry on conversations. But it's a whole business that this is a tsunami of change coming that's driven by this kind of technology. Now, we've gone through first, second, third industrial revolutions already, and we're clearly into the fourth industrial revolution, which in the case of these references, they call it hyper exponential growth, because you've got a combination of things that are happening, and this is the perfect tsunami of these things coming together. So you got Moore's law, doubling the components so the speed increases. You got technology adoptions coming, and then you also got the marriage now of artificial intelligence. So you have this perfect storm of three different types of activities and products and services and technology that are coming together at the same time. So in this case, we got the technology up at the top. We have the software side, which is with AI, artificial intelligence, and all it's bringing. And then you have the development of the cloud in general. And that is now basically a standard fare of data storage and access capability. And then you have inside that cloud a lot of applications that are commonplace to us now that weren't here even 5 years ago. And I stopped and blew this one up for showing was because stop and look at those icons that are in there, as I call them, apps in the cloud. I mean, now we take it as commonplace that the watches we wear are doing body monitoring, are taking care of messaging on our wrists and communications. Look at the building in the upper right. That could be a university now. You can take any kind of courses and education online, just anywhere in the world that you have connectivity. You have all your services in medical that are highly connected. And you even that grocery cart in the middle, who would have thought 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that you could buy your groceries from Amazon online and have them delivered to your door the next day? I mean, those are all things that are commonplace with the fundamental core of this technology, software, and the expansion of the cloud that's driving strategy development and execution as well. And quite frankly, there's no turning back from it because it just keeps growing exponentially. So let's talk about these core strategy development and execution components. Typically, you're going to have the situational analysis type of tools, and that includes the standard fare of SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, and opportunities and threats, both looking external and internal. And you're going to look at the macro environment on the outside, which is going to be having impacts on your individual organization. Your market analysis side is going to take a look at one of the things is your distribution channels and your success factors. And this one is universal. These two are universal across for-profit, government, or nonprofit. What are your distribution channels? What are your key success factors? And then your consumer analysis or your constituent analysis is what is their demographics? What are their expectations on consumption of your services or products? And what are their motivations and what needs to change? And what kind of purchasing practices are there? Now, there's any number of tools inside of this situational analysis techniques. There's things like scenario planning. You could do Michael Porter's 5 forces. The list is huge. In fact, I just did a quick survey of my Kindle library, and I've got books in there to say, here's the 80 strategy tools you need to know. Here are the 25 KPIs you need to know. Here's the 10,000 KPIs you need to know. I mean, this day and age, you can use what's available to determine what's right for your organization. But I will attest that a standard SWOT analysis backed up with some of the market and consumer analysis and macro environment, that puts you on a pretty firm ground moving forward. If you're a for-profit organization, you are definitely going to do a competitive analysis. That goes back to the Mach 3, Harry's, Dollar Shave Club, and Turbo Razor example. And competitive analysis, I think we all know the name Kodak, and Kodak in a period of about 2 to 3 years was off the map because they didn't move from the film medium to the digital. And they tried, but they still didn't get the formula right. And so this competitive analysis, if you don't do it on a continuous basis, can creep up to you, and that will cause what we're going to see in a little while, a disruption. And that's because maybe you were not paying to one of the other dimensions of strategy, which is innovation. Strategy, you're still at this point, you're still going to design, and even in the future, your base components, your mission, your vision. You're going to determine what your customer and stakeholder needs are, because That's the whole purpose your organization exists, to deliver some value to your customers and stakeholders. And then you're going to take that over from there and move it through a series of techniques to create a customer value proposition. I mean, the value proposition starts out with, what's the pricing? What's your economics? What's your features and functions? Do you have what they want? Do you have good quality services and products? And do you have them unavailable when they need them? I mean, I know I very rarely these days go into a brick and mortar store because I can order just about anything I want online and have it delivered by the next day. When you get done with those elements, you're going to create your strategic objectives or goals. And these are, again, the continuous improvement activities. They're going to make your strategy successful, or at least let you know if what you thought was your strategy is being successful or not, with the upcoming KPIs that we're going to design around these. You got to have a visual. And the visual, if it doesn't do anything more than creating a series of icons or images that shows how your strategy is connected together, that's probably the most important thing. One of the things that is very prevalent today is infographics. I don't think any of us have been on the internet where we haven't seen infographics. And I've seen some of our clients do some pretty creative things with rolling out and telling everyone is willing to look at it, what they're, by the way of their infographic, exactly what their strategy is. I actually saw one client, they created their infographic and they actually put on the infographic path, they had the strategy journey, they actually put on there the results from their internal surveys that had some of the negative things that were fed back. And they were showing in the infographic how those negative elements were being resolved by the strategy. So they were using it as a very massive communications piece internally. KPIs, no question about it. In fact, I always tell clients when they get to this point, you're going to look back at all those other core elements that you just built, you know, the visual, the objectives, the assessments and strategy and all those elements. You're going to look back at that, and when you get to the performance measures or strategic measures and targets, you're going to say, wow, that was pretty easy back there, because this is the heavy lifting. First thing is you have to have strategic measures. This is a strategy. This is not an operational strategy. This is strategic. So that we were very critical about what's operational KPIs and what are strategic KPIs. And strategic KPIs are outcomes or end outcomes. And so those are the ones that we're measuring here. And of course, there's targets set across those. And I mentioned earlier, it's one thing to design the KPI, but you got to have the right metrics. You got to have the right data. The data has to tell the story that is the intended result of those objectives or goals purported to tell. I mean, because if it doesn't, then the KPI is pretty much meaningless. So it's got to tell the story of that intended result for those objectives or those goals. Strategic initiatives, I place this all by itself because, once again, this is one of the fault lines I talked about earlier. I know a lot of clients that have over 150 or 160 projects on their inventory, and they only have 250 or 300 people in the firm. I mean, so are you telling me that every project's assigned to one person, or maybe a project and a half, or something like that? But the fact of the matter is, this is a common problem in most organizations, and it doesn't matter if it's for-profit, government, or nonprofit. You're spending all your time working on your initiatives, thinking you're solving your strategy. And because that's what you like to do, and that's what everybody does every day if they've been assigned to do some work in projects and initiatives. The fact of the matter is you have to get the list of strategic initiatives down to a manageable number, and so that you can raise the probability of your success of completing the projects. I mean, and I take a small straw poll at the beginning of each class, or even with the client, saying, you know, give me a show of hands. Are you guys really good at executing all your projects? And I have to tell you, not many hands goes up. And it doesn't really matter what the organization is. So you have to get serious about project management and getting the people at least trained in some fashion so that they understand what goes into initiating a project or planning a project or controlling it. And then, of course, executing it and then closing it. There's just as much communications inside of projects as there is in the organization itself for the strategy. So this is very, very critical going forward and to be successful on. While performance analysis is starting to reveal how well you're doing, both on those KPIs and on those projects, because now you're measuring exactly what you said was important in those KPIs and in those projects. And in those projects, it really comes down to just two things on the projects. Are you meeting your milestones that you set? And are you meeting the budget expansion at those milestones? You can measure all other kind of project things like earned value and where you are on track to actual project, et cetera. And most elaborate project management systems will do that automatically. But at the end of the day, it's on time and on budget. That's the key element. And all of that goes into delivering intelligence to the executives or the objective owners so that they understand what's happening. Why is this objective on customer satisfaction gone down from an 8.5 to a 7.6? What was the problem? And performance analysis systems in this day and age, they are built in the cloud and they give you the best turnaround and the best efficiency, and they make you more productive in analyzing your data. Now, that's, I guess, my attempt to say, if you have to use Excel, fine, you have to use Excel, but you have to really study the benefits of getting something that can give you information faster, cheaper, and better, and more manipulative so that you can run different scenarios against the data. And in this case, one of the things that is out here is the business performance and the strategy analysis so that the users can see and everybody can see what the results of the strategy is. Strategy alignment is that cascading or alignment across the divisions, the departments, and then down eventually to the people, down to teams and individuals. The supporting cast here are just the departments. And it could be any size department. The manager may have 2 or 3 people help create the strategy, and then that gets cascaded or aligned down to the individuals that work in that department and exactly what they want to do. They're going to have strategic objectives or goals, just like it says, and that leadership is going to have to, again, make it very visible, walk the talk with those departmental and those divisions as well, and team leaders and supervisors. And you have to understand that in these side of these departments, you've got a corporate culture, and this is just reality. Everybody likes to think, oh, we got one culture here. But reality is, corporate's got its culture, but then inside some of these departments, they've got their own culture. It's a subset of corporate, but it's recognized as a little different. This is how we really do things inside of Department A. And so those motivational factors and cultures have to make sure that they're analyzed as well and assessed so that there's a good match between the corporate and the division and the departments. Now, strategy evaluation, that's all about saying, is this working or not? Is our system working? Is our strategy working? If we don't have objectives that are doing well, why not? Are we making our projects? Are we making our KPIs? And what has to change for the next year? And that's why I mentioned earlier about at least looking at the strategy 3 times a year. First 3 quarters, you don't spend a lot of deep dive time, but you just meet as a strategy group to say, here's what's happening. And this is a function, by the way, that's normally done by a strategy management office. So consequently, they're the oversight. They see everything. They're in the intelligence gathering business so that they can turn the intelligence and the information back to the rest of the organization. And when the 4th quarter comes, they're going to spend a couple of days together really looking at every component that was built as a part of the core. Does any core components have to change? Maybe some objectives need to be changed. Maybe we've had an introduction in some kind of new technology that's come in, and we don't have that covered in our current strategy. We have to make that change going forward. So my clients typically spend a couple of days doing this, and they have the objective owners come in and report exactly what's transpiring, along with the strategy management office. Well, what about these dimensions that are affecting strategy development and execution? We talked about leadership before. Leadership at all levels has to be very positive. They have to walk the talk. They have to constantly talk about it. And they have to take every opportunity to make sure that they reinforce the strategy at any point in time and with any group of constituents or stakeholders or customers that they have a chance to go with, and especially the stakeholders, which are the employees and the managers of those employees. Now, the culture, no question about it, as I said earlier, it's a foundational dimension affecting strategy development. But in this case, I put as a foundational element or dimension trust. I have to categorically say it. If you have a culture that's broken and you do enough analysis of it, eventually you're probably going to find your trust is broken as well. And that's one of the things you have to go work on first, is to get the trust back up to a reasonable level and then start to go back to work on the culture. A little later, we'll see something on processes. And there's some literature out there now that basically says from a lot of executives, you know, if you got a culture problem, you know, don't try to fix the culture, just fix the processes, because the processes that are broken are driving a lot of the problems with culture and trust. And so you have to really look at this from all sides as to what's really the culture, what's driving a weak culture or a poor culture in an organization. Strategic thinking, that's a dimension that goes without saying, especially after you've built a strategy and you've developed one and it's now executing. But there are some elements inside of this strategic thinking set of boxes that's important. First of all, you have to be, by nature, an idea generating organization, because if you don't have new ideas being generated, you're just repeating the same thing you're doing year after year after year. And after a while, your strategy is going to say, well, okay, I can deliver these many things, but you know, as an executive or a manager, you're looking around the business landscape, you got to start doing some things differently. Also, you have to be an organization that proactively goes out and asks for ideas. There are plenty of crowdsourcing tools out there today that you can do that, and they are focused on the strategic thinking side, but they're also focused on the innovation side that will be coming up. You have to be very ready to get into a continual cycle of strategic planning. I already mentioned that you're going to do it at least 4 times a year for your strategy. And by the way, you want to make sure people are thinking outside the box. And if they're thinking outside the box and submitting ideas that are outside of the box, how are you going to reward and recognize them going forward? And then eventually, you're going to have to look at time management here, because you can't just make a big splash about, oh, we're generating ideas now, we're asking you for ideas, and you get all the ideas in and nothing happens. So you have to get that into its own process, so that the time management is critical, so that you get things back on track and get moving on what these new ideas and these out-of-the-box ideas are. And also now, processes I mentioned before. Your strategy is going to work well over, you get it honed down and fairly well operational and from year to year, over 2 to 3 years. And then somebody's going to ask that question I mentioned earlier, how do we move this bar higher? And that's when you have to turn inward and look at your processes to see which ones typically need to be changed. There are instances in the first couple of years when you're starting to measure the performance of some of those objectives, that the processes will show up on the radar screen as a potential roadblock to getting the results that you want on particular strategic objectives and goals. And of course, you're going to tackle those right away. Sustainability, no question. We talked about the military basis, but this is all about, you're going to plan, you're going to implement, you're going to evaluate it, and you're going to improve it. And that's a continual cycle that always goes through the same process. You want the strategy system, you want the strategy to be almost like self-perpetual energy that just keeps moving at its same cadence and momentum, only by the fact that it has to be driven by the human element, which is, we're going to meet on these dates on this time to look at these elements. And if you do that, you'll create sustainability on its own. Communications, right in the center, communications plans. By the way, you're going to have a communication plan for the organization. And then when you align or cascade down into the divisions or departments, you're going to have communications plans for them. And then if you're very adept at this, you'll get together with HR and say, maybe we should do some communications on some of the teams and individuals that are knocking the ball out of the park on accomplishments. And now you can use that as a way to energize the rest of the workforce by doing some simple communications involved with that. Innovation, this is the big elephant in the room right now. And I've got some follow-up charts that will help focus on the innovation side. But, you know, it is about doing some amount of research, motivation, invention, creativity, technology, idea, and experimentation. And by the way, in innovation organizations, they have to be tolerant of failure. I mean, if you have an organization that failure is an option, but you're going to penalize teams or individuals for it, you might as well not even start down the innovation path. I mean, you have to be tolerant of failures because everything's going to be charted out, scoped out. It's going to be handled like a separate project, and there'll be sign-offs. And if everybody's on board and you know what the risk is and you know what the probability of success is or not, and you still go ahead, you got to look at it as a learning moment and say, okay, we tried this and it was around this technology and around this process. It didn't work, but this is what we learned. We're just not going to repeat the history again on the next project that has something to do with this. Now, disruption is, I think, very classically illustrated by this chart. You're moving left to right down the path of your strategy, and it's executing, and you think it's executing well, and right out of left field comes this big arrow that's a disruptor. This is the Harry's. This is the Dollar Shave Club. This is the Turbo Shaver when looked at from Gillette's Mach 3 side. And something happened that they came in because you weren't doing one of those competitive analysis assessments early on that you were keeping an eye on what the competition is doing. So what you have to do with regards to innovation, and I'll start out in the government and nonprofit world, is you have to do an adaptation or an adoption of, and we adapted the alchemy of growth, which is applied predominantly toward for-profit organizations, but we can adapt it to look at innovation. And in the case of government and nonprofit, you're looking at the program and service reach and effectiveness that those organizations and agencies can deliver to their constituents and their stakeholders. Your core innovation is the delivery of your existing operations, programs and services. You just have to hone it down, get it cheaper, better, faster, and of good quality. But you know in your business or in your space, as I call it, you need to improve your cost effectiveness on existing programs and services. This might be just taking something that's existing and applying some new technology or a new process to it. I mean, we're not talking about the next big thing out of Silicon Valley here. We're talking about just making a minor change to something that does improve the cost efficiency and effectiveness. Now, if you move up to a transformative state in a government and nonprofit, you're now going to solve problems with new solutions and or new partners. Partnering is pretty standard fare in a lot of sectors of the world these days, both for-profit and nonprofit and government, because you don't have the bandwidth in terms of people resources or technology to do everything you'd like to do maybe at Horizon 3. So you have to do some partnering to make that happen. Now, if you're a for-profit organization, that y-axis is all about profit performance. I mean, at the end of the day, it's profit. And Horizon 1 is you're going to defend and extend and defend your core business, and you're going to work innovation into those existing operations and markets right there. Current day, current stuff, current operations, current markets, current products. You're going to exchange. You're going to make some exchanges in innovation to help that. Now, Horizon 2 says, I need to build or spin off an emerging business. Either I need to grow it organically or I need to acquire it. And that allows us to move to Horizon 2. And that's typically called adjacent. They're innovation, new but related areas to the business and markets. And Horizon 3 is almost what I call the twilight zone for a for-profit organization. You're really on the fringe. You're early adopters of technology, new transformative ways to do things, and you're going to maybe look at creating businesses along the way. And very routinely, for-profit organizations cycle these Horizon 2s down to 1, Horizon 3s down to 2, and that allows them to keep the cycle moving as they keep innovating as they go through the life of the organization. Change management, no question about it. Engagement, planning, improving, measuring, execute, team. Just the basic fact that you're running the strategy and it's running well, and you're making changes based on what decisions are made with the strategy, and also you ramped up your communications and your projects are running well, you're executing on change management by itself. Risk, on the other hand, introduces and is probably going to be more prevalent in a lot of things that you do today. And in the case of risk, you've got a number of things that you have to take a look at, such as strategy. You got to make sure it's built, strategies built in, both, remember I said, at the project and at the enterprise level. You got to have control, acceptance, reduction, and mitigation. But more importantly, when you identify a risk that's pretty high probability, what are you going to do to avoid it, or how are you going to transfer it so that it doesn't have a negative impact on your organization? And next, the customer. We already talked, the customer is king. They're everything that's got to be done for the customer in terms of, you know, what their expectations are, what they demand, because in this day and age with that technology and the cloud and access to information, it's too easy for the customer to change. In days of the brick and mortar store on the corner, when it had only that set of products or services you were looking for, to make a change was troublesome. Now you can do a change at the hit of a button, and it's all you got to do is get the right web link, look at the reviews, get some recommendations. And so let's take another example. You guys have seen the examples of Carvana, Cars.com, Car Gurus. How many of you recently in the last 12 months have bought a car strictly online? I actually was at a class I was teaching last week, and there was a person in the class that had bought a car from Carvana. And he said, I asked him, I said, did you finance it through Carvana? Yep. Did you go pick it up in person? Yep. He said, it's a real experience. He did the vending machine thing. You've seen those ads on TV. That is what the customer is looking for, is the convenience of making that decision and that sale. Financial is all about looking at the right capital, the right investment. Your finance department will help you with this. Of course, you got to have a strategy to go forward. You have to have the plan that's growing, especially if you're for profit. I actually had one client that I recommended. They were going for an extension in their line of credit, and I just happened to say, you know, you might want to take your strategy plan with you and maybe tie your line of credit increase to your initiatives and show them what you're going to do with the money. And when I saw him about a month later, he showed me the report that they gave the financing institution. He said they gave us twice as much because they said your plan is rock solid. So that's what strategies development and strategy execution can do for you going forward. All right, workforce dynamics. There's no question a lot is in play here because, as I said earlier, it doesn't matter how great a strategy you create, what teams of people work on that strategy, and you know, you can build buy-in all the way through that strategy. But if you don't pay attention to some of the elements on this workforce dynamics screen, then you're going to create valleys for yourself that are going to be tough to get out of. And I want to start right with the very first one in the middle. You got to have core values. Very hard to believe in this day and age. Sometimes when we get called in to do assist and facilitate strategy building with clients, we'll start to do a pre-analysis of what they got, and we don't see any evidence of values. It's almost unconscionable, at least to me personally. But these are things that are put in place. Everybody knows at a fundamental basis why they come to work every day and how they're expected to act. I have one client that everyone has the lanyards and they have their badge, and you know, their badge gets them into the building and different rooms. The second badge behind it is their values. They wear their values every day, and actually have managements told me they check to see if they got 2 badges on that lanyard. So next thing is employee engagement. If you don't have work satisfaction monitored and asked, you have to do that to make sure that people feel like they're happy with their work and the work they're doing. They know that's what the company wants. Leadership's got to be involved. You got to provide them capabilities for growth. You got to watch the relationships. You got to have some kind of wellness programs these days. The generational gaps are changing the whole way the workplace works. I mean, here in Silicon Valley, we have some of the biggest companies in the world out here. Their whole aspect of employee engagement is like off the charts when compared to the rest of the in fact, the rest parts of the United States. When I travel to the United States and I say I'm from Silicon Valley, and they say, oh yeah, you're from the places that pick the people up in the morning, take them to work, give them breakfast, feed them lunch, pack up dinner, and take them back to home. I said, well, that's just the way they run their business. I said, because they're in a competitive world looking for the best people. And that's the things that you have to bring back, and that's an employee well-being program. But more importantly, this concept of an employee value proposition. We talked about the customer value proposition earlier, and that was, you know, the attributes, which were the price, the quality, the timeliness, and the terms and conditions, or the feature functions of the products or services you were buying, and also the image and relationship. You have to do the same thing with employees. What is the employee value proposition? And then you have to move to employee motivation. What motivates them? And this whole conference in Saudi Arabia is about empowerment. Starts out with empowerment. And how are you rewarding and recognizing them? But at the same token, how are you making everybody accountable? Once you do all this core value things and the employee and engagement things, what are you doing to make them accountable? And you know what? I think people genuinely want to feel accountable for the work that they're asked to do and produce. And they just need to know that they get a reward, some kind of recognition. They know that helps them grow, and they want to seek success just like anyone else. And then over on the other side, we've got putting these teams together in high performance. And basically, you've got a strategy. Once at this point, you should have a strategy completed, and you're doing operational planning. You got a team that put it together. You've got the culture underway from earlier, and you got processes in place so that they're aligned. You got engagement and development from the left side of this chart, and now you can set about building these teams so that you build accountability in to those teams and to the individual as you go forward. Now, I think we're done. We got about 10. We're done a little early. Let's see what kind of questions we have here. And here we go. Okay, good. All right, Nadeem, importance of data can't be overemphasized. However, in absence of detailed data, how far practical is it to base the initiatives on an organizational scan? Okay, you said the magic words when you said, you know, in the absence, if you don't have detailed data. Fundamentally, Nadeem, there are four things that you have to take a look at when you create baseline data. First is, hopefully you got baseline data. That would be a good thing, and it's close to what your strategic objective intended result is. Second of all, you could do some benchmarking to similar things in like industries, but there's pros and cons to that. The third thing is you could use the data that you've got to help move a particular objective that you know intuitively, and maybe there's some position power involved with somebody that owns that objective that wants to see something done. But then the fourth one is you got to make an educated guess as to, you know, what the targets are with, you know, going forward. So fundamentally, if you make a guess, an educated guess, that says you're signing up to watch it more frequently because you know it's a guess. It's an educated guess. So in the absence of data, you can go as far as you feel you're practically permitted to go intuitively before you get into a real twilight zone and you don't know what the answer is going to be. We had another question here about what to do concretely concerning the risk. The exposed seems much theoretic. Now, you have to classify your risks, there's no question about it. And you have to go through a probability assessment, impact probability chart analysis, that's an XY axis, so that you can assess certain probabilities of certain risks and break it up into quadrants. And that's going to help you look at the ones which are theoretic and which ones are more practical. I work for the another question, I work for the government, how to focus on the customer since their profile is not really standard. Well, I would attest that you can probably, when you assess or survey enough of the customers, and oh, by the way, mentioning survey of customers, I always get clients look at me like deer in the headlights. It's like, you want us to run a survey for our customer population and it's 10,000 people? I said, yeah, I do. I said, but here's what I want you to do. I want you to get with a statistician of your organization, and I want you to design statistically significant sample sizes. I mean, first of all, on a large population, you want to run a survey to the entire population once a year. You're waiting around for 11 months until the data comes in. Then you got to analyze it for another 2 months after that. So it's now pretty old data. What you want to do is you want to break it up into chunks, and you want to run surveys on a regular basis. And guess what? In that sample size, significant sample size, you don't have to survey the same people again on a large population. And then pretty soon you can start to see the patterns through the composite indices that you can put together from those. So you still have to analyze them, and you'll start to see some patterns come out of there. Another question, are there particular software that enhance data visualization in strategy presentation? These questions will be captured, and I will send you back a list of the ones that can help do the visualization, but I have to tell you, there's some pretty good tools out there in the cloud these days that are very, very rich in visualization and easy to do and very inexpensive. But I'll be sending out, Candace will earmark, Dr. Solomon, your question on that one. Well, of course, the budgets, you asked about the budgets on the surveys. It's another task, it's another initiative that has to be done. But if the data value is important, you have to do it. And in the case of understanding who your customers or your constituents are, you have to do it. And it's your constituents are the most important process about why you're there, is to serve them. And thank you for the other comments as we go on. Again, as I said, you'll be getting a copy of this presentation. You get a link, and it'll be an audible replay of everything that I've been talking about here today, and you'll get a copy of these slides as well. And in the meantime, if you have any questions when you get the link in the survey, or I'm sorry, in the presentation, you can always contact me directly at this email address. I hope this was valuable information, and I think all of us that participate in surveys hope we always learn something new. And I hope putting all of these parts together, both as core and dimensions, kind of helps you see the whole landscape of what you're going to have to consider when you start creating a future strategy going forward. Have a great rest of the day, everyone, and hope to see you on another survey next month that we're putting on. Thank you, and have a good rest of the day.